Good morning, Professor Shulman. Thanks so much for joining us. It's really good to be with you once again on this feast of Our Lady of the Rosary.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
What are your thoughts on this one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks when literally Israel's 9/11 happened, the largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust?
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful day to be having this conversation because now we call the feast Our Lady of the Rosary, but originally it was Our Lady of Victory. And of course, it was commemorating Our Lady's intercession at the Battle of Lepanto to save Europe from Islamic conquest. And if you look at the origins of Our Lady of Victory and the origins of the Battle of Lepanto, you see a tremendous parallel with what's going on now, because when Saint Pope Pius V called for all of Christendom to pray the Rosary daily, he started doing that actually months before the Battle of Lepanto, and his request was to pray the Rosary for victory in the battle, to prevent a conquest of essentially Christendom by the Muslims. And he didn't call for a ceasefire, and he didn't call for de-escalation. He actually called for victory because the Christendom had to be defended from an obvious threat, a pronounced threat, one that had already been announced. Now, Hamas's charter calls for the annihilation of Israel. Hezbollah's charter calls for the annihilation of Israel. The PLO charter called for the annihilation of Israel. So with all due respect, I would suggest that the idea of a ceasefire and de-escalation is actually quite the opposite of the Battle of Lepanto and the origins of the Feast of Our Lady of Victory.
Well, there's no doubt that this is on the Holy Father's mind. Pope Francis having called for this global day of prayer and fasting for peace as the conflict in the Holy Land continues to escalate day after day.
Well, except the question is whether peace can be achieved as long as one of the parties involved is dedicated to the annihilation of the other.
That is so true, and that is part of the challenge. And only the good Lord knows how this is eventually going to develop. But the one thing that we do know for sure, Professor, is that for Israel and the citizens of Gaza this past year has been a tremendous tragedy. Of course, with the war now spreading to Lebanon, with Hezbollah, attacking, not to mention the attacks from Iran recently with all the missiles. How do you see this situation in the Holy Land, in Israel, and can you see a spiritual perspective to this?
Well, I see nothing but a spiritual perspective to this. First of all, my mental model of what's going on is a little bit different from the war spreading from Gaza to Lebanon and now to Iran, because in fact, Hamas is entirely funded and actually directed by Iran, as is Hezbollah, as are the Houthis in Yemen. So this is actually, the war isn't spreading from one side, from one element to another. It's actually Iran attacking Israel or trying to solve the problem of Jews in the Middle East on 7 fronts. And the October 7th attack from Hamas was supposed to be a coordinated attack with Hezbollah. And that was the plan, was that they would attack essentially simultaneously, and Hamas jumped the gun. And it's a long story, but that's well documented that it wasn't supposed to be first Hamas alone and only then Hezbollah getting involved. And even now, when there's talk of a ceasefire, Hezbollah says we are not going to engage in a ceasefire unless there's a ceasefire in Gaza. They've totally, united their intentions. So I'm sorry, I forgot your question. Spiritual underpinnings. Well, I think the spiritual underpinnings are the exact same spiritual underpinnings behind the Battle of Lepanto, which is that the Christian Great Commission in Christianity is go out and make disciples of all nations and bring them into the kingdom of Christ. And the Great Commission in Islam is that the whole world has to submit to Allah through Islam. And Christianity abhors the use of force as a mechanism to bring about the Great Commission. And from the days of Muhammad on, Islam has embraced the use of force to enforce the Great Commission. So that's what I think the spiritual underpinnings of this are.
And so to really understand what's happening today, you have to be able to go back in history and understand that relationship that has existed between Islam and the Jewish people, and Islam and Christianity, for that matter.
Absolutely. It's Islam and non-Islam, actually. It's like the Great Commission. There are no people on earth who aren't invited into the kingdom of Christ, and there are no people on earth who aren't to be forced to enter the kingdom of Islam, essentially.
I want to open up the phone lines here in the minutes that we have left. If you'd like to share with us your reaction on this one-year anniversary of the attack on Israel by Hamas, how concerning is it to see these recent attacks by Iran on Israel? Could we be seeing yet a further escalation of this war? We're taking your calls for Professor Roy Schoeman, a Jewish convert into the Catholic faith and the author of Salvation is from the Jews. Our number, 888-914-9149, 888-914-9149. Professor, when we spoke back in the spring, there were all those anti-Semitic protests that were going on. Some of them, on the college campuses at places like Columbia and UCLA and many other colleges across the country, as well as, away from campuses in major cities across our country. We haven't seen as much of it, but that is still out there, Professor.
Yes, it's very unfortunate that the military conflict has provided a platform for kind of a covert anti-Semitism to surface and be celebrated.
What is your thoughts on why? What is the root of such hatred for the Jewish people? I mean, it's shocking to see in this day and age, to see people having that kind of hatred in their hearts for the Jewish people.
Well, I think basically there are two major sources of influence for humanity, and one is Christ and the Most Holy Trinity, and the other is Satan. And I think that the hatred of the Jewish people is actually because, in some sense, I know it's kind of unfortunate that they don't recognize Christ, and I'm doing all I can to correct that minor error, but they are the people from whom Christ came, and they are, we know from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that the second coming, which is going to be the ultimate defeat of Satan, can't happen until there's a widespread conversion of the Jews. And I think these are reasons why Satan's arrows are particularly aimed at the Jews, and anyone who is on the wrong side is a useful idiot, so to speak. In other words, everybody involved who is evil, so to speak, is a sucker, and is the agency behind their evil is because basically they've allowed themselves to be influenced by the wrong spirituality. But until they're dead, of course, we pray for them to repent and get on the right side and end up in heaven with all of us. So it's not a condemnation of the individuals, but the spiritual battle is the ultimate kind of causal agency.
Thomas is joining us this morning from Providence, Rhode Island. Good morning, Thomas. Welcome to Morning Air. You're on with Professor Schoeman.
Thanks for having me. My question for the professor, so I was a political science major at Providence College, and I'm also a faithful Catholic. And the position that you said I agree with, but is pretty unpopular, namely that peace isn't always, or at least immediate peace, is not always the desired solution, at least from a spiritual perspective, especially when an aggressor is attacking the church indirectly, proxy via Israel. So my question for you is, in terms of as Catholics that are also political citizens, what should our perspective be? What should we be praying for? We shouldn't be praying for Israel to just lie down and become incinerated. But at the same time, we are morally bound to not pray for active war that isn't just. So I'm just curious how you would take those two things and then intertwine them in a way that would help us to do God's will. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that excellent question. Pope Pius V is a saint. Pope Pius V spent 3 years trying to get Christian Europe to attack the Muslim fleet, the Ottoman fleet. The Battle of Lepanto was not a port in Europe. Lepanto was the home port of the Islamic fleet, of the Muslim fleet, of the Ottoman fleet. The just war theory, and my wife is a philosophy professor at Ave Maria, and we just had this conversation this morning. Just war theory calls for essentially preemptive war when it's necessary to stop an aggressor from doing an announced intended act of aggression. So it's not by definition, what Pope Pius V did could not be a violation of just war theory.
Appreciate the call. Thanks so much, Thomas. We go to George joining us this morning from the West Coast, from California. Good morning, George. You're on with Professor Shulman.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Professor Shulman for the good advice that he gave regarding the prayers. Words have meanings. And when Hamas and Hezbollah say that they want to annihilate Israel, well, I believe them, and that's what they want to do. Therefore, I pray first for total victory for Israel against the evil Hamas and Hezbollah.
Thank you. And as I'm sure you know, Iran has called for the eradication of the United States as well. So Israel's victory is not just a defense of Israel. It's actually a defense of the entire Western world, and in particular the United States.
Appreciate the call. Professor, your final thoughts on this day in which we honor Our Lady of the Rosary and also remember this anniversary of the Hamas attacks on Israel.
Well, in the long run, the strongest weapon we have, period, is prayer. And, of course, prayer through the Blessed Virgin Mary. So I think that, if we don't know exactly how to pray and what we should be praying for, we can certainly pray, please, Mary, take this in your hands. Please, Mary, bring about the right solution. We don't have to actually presume to know what that right solution is. We can still fervently pray for her intercession to bring about God's will and to bring about what's good for the kingdom of Christ and for all of humanity.
And we're reminded by Sister Lucia Fatima that there is nothing that cannot be solved by praying the Rosary. Professor Shulman, as always, thanks so much for being with us and for your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to do this. And I also want to thank the callers because they really contributed to the flows. And thank you for everything you're doing, of course, and Relevant Radio.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Roy Shulman, Jewish convert to the Catholic faith and the author of Salvation is from the Jews. And